We'd refer to artillery in this era by the weight of the solid shot it fired. For the purpose of this battle, we are concerned with the most common field artillery sizes of 3 and 6 pounders. In Europe in this era, guns were typically organized into batteries of 6 to 8 crews. During the Revolution, you do see the use of batteries in many northern battles, but in the South, with smaller armies and more austere environments, large batteries with heavy wagons and lots of horses to feed wasn't practical. That's why at this battle, we have guns operating as independent sections of 2 guns. And there are some occasions in this war where we can see a single artillery piece being detached to go assist partisan fighters. Gun crews consisted of about 15 men per gun, but for the actual firing of the piece, it required about 6 to 8 men. The way it would work is that the gun would be brought into battery, we would then detach the gun from the limber. The limber, which is attached to the horses, would be taken to a safe distance away, and then the gun crew would finally get to work. Now, for the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to assume that the gun has already been fired so we can get everybody involved in the process. The first thing that happens is that this gun crew member would take his worm and he'd put it down the barrel and he'd search the piece. Now what he's doing is he's looking for any linen that's been left over, because at this time, all ammunition is packaged with gunpowder either in linen or paper bags. So he doesn't want to have anything still burning in the barrel before they shove more ammunition into it. Now once that gun crew member has finished his job, the gun member on this side would take a sponge, dip it typically into a bucket they have with them with water in it. Get the sponge wet, and then he's going to swab the barrel. What he's doing essentially is he's making sure that anything was too small to be pulled out by the worm can now be doused with water. Now the entire time they've been doing that, the gun member back here has a thumb stall on it. And what he's been doing is he's been holding it over a small hole in the breech of the weapon. What they're doing is they're essentially working together to make sure that there's nothing still burning inside of this gun tube. We've had somebody pull out the burning embers, we've had somebody douse it with water, and what he's doing is he's preventing oxygen from rushing in through that touch hole. These guys working together are making sure that the gun tube has been rendered safe before they put the next piece of ammunition in. Now the entire time they've already been working on the gun, there's been another gun crew member who's run back to the limber, gotten the ammunition that was requested by the gun captain, and is now running it forward. Here we have an example again. We have the cannonball, a wooden sabot, and then the powder charge in a cloth bag. It would be delivered to the gun member here. He would then take it and place it into the muzzle of the weapon. Now we come back to this gun crew member. He has the sponge on one end, he has a rammer on the other. It's his job to make sure that piece of ammunition is seated at the breech of the weapon. We now return to the gun crew member who's had his thumb over this touch hole the entire time. He can now release his thumb from that position because he's got a couple other pieces of equipment. He has a priming wire. What he does with that is he places it into the gun and he essentially makes sure that the gunpowder bag has now been ripped open. Once it's exposed, he then has a quill primer. Typically that's going to be, when you think of a goose quill pen, you lob the end of it off and you impregnate that with gunpowder, and that's going to serve as your fuse. Once he's put that in there, it's now in contact with exposed powder for the main charge. Now depending on the manual they used at the time, the next step would be to aim the gun, but the difference in the manuals would either be aiming the gun before it was pricked and primed or afterwards. The gun captain would come up and he typically used what's called an elevation screw at the base of the gun. It's simply a little simple screw mechanism that could elevate or depress the gun tube. Another way that they would aim is that another gun crew member would have what is called a handspike. It's simply a piece of wood that goes into the tail of the gun that would allow them to traverse the gun left and right. Once the gun captain is happy, we finally get to the guy who is standing here. He's been waiting patiently this entire time, slowly stoking a slow match. Simple cord that slowly burns down because it is his job to make sure that this gun goes off when the gun captain requires it. Once he gets the signal, he gives it a big sweep, gives that piece of cord a nice big breath of oxygen, and then touches it to the fuse. The fuse burns down, hits the main charge, fires the ball out, and the entire gun will roll back about 3, 4, 5 feet. Finally, the gun crew has to roll the gun back into its firing position so that the gun captain has a consistent point of aim. On a bigger gun, those additional 6 crew members would be responsible for this because they'd have drag ropes that would help pull the gun forward again. But for a smaller gun like this 3-pounder, the front gunners would be important to this process because they might have prolongs where they can simply attach a cord to the axle of the gun And the two front gunners can help pull it back into position or pull it to keep up with the line of infantry, while the rear gunners would lift the trail of the gun. And once the gun is finally back in position, that entire process starts all over again. A good gun crew could probably get about 2 rounds per minute, while in emergency situations, they could potentially skip a few steps to keep firing case shot and canister as fast as possible if they have a line of infantry rapidly approaching. The artillery's job in a battle like this is to reach out and disrupt the infantry. As the British Army arrives here, that is what Anthony Singleton's 6-pounders do. Seeing the British far in the distance on the road, a dense column of infantry was a prime target. Guns of this era were firing solid iron balls. Exploding shells would have only been used in howitzers and mortars in this era, and there are no mortars or howitzers at Guilford Courthouse. Ideally, a gun crew doesn't want to have its shot land on its target. It wants to skip the ball through it. A dense column of men stacked up behind each other on the road is the perfect way to do that. Once infantry deploy into their long lines, the ability to wreak havoc is reduced with solid shot. But with a target that is now wide and close, artillery can shift to firing a different type of ammunition. We will talk more about those types of ammunition when we get to the 3rd American Line. Major Hubbard of Colonel Munford's regiment had the skirt of his coat shot away by a cannonball, and his horse slightly wounded by the same. There were not, however, about 10 men killed and wounded during the whole cannonade, in which I believe 6 pieces of artillery were constantly employed for a half hour. A ball struck him in the head, as he was resting on one knee to keep himself more steady, which made his posture coincide with the parabolic curve of the descending ball. It tore out the spine the whole length of the body. As the battle opened that morning, cannonballs soared through the woods, knocking limbs off of trees, and a few British shots that were aimed too high soared into the American second line, and even killed a horse that was close to the road. When the British infantry advanced, the American 6-pounders began their retreat to the 3rd line, and the infantry fight at Guilford Courthouse finally began. Infantry are the heart of the army here, as they would have been in Europe. Artillery and cavalry work to aid these soldiers in accomplishing their tactical tasks and strategic objectives. Infantry of this era typically fought in 3 ranks in close order. That means 3 rows of men, where the men are about 6 inches apart from the guy next to them. Once again, just like the cavalry and the artillery, in the American War of Independence, both sides adapted their practices. By 1776, the British were commonly using loose and open order. So instead of soldiers being nearly shoulder to shoulder, they could also line up with gaps of 18 inches or larger between the files of men. Fighting in difficult terrain made that a necessity. The previously mentioned lack of cavalry also makes it a possibility, as dense formations were also meant to repel cavalry charges. A persistent myth is that the British lost the war because they had no idea how to fight in the woods, how to use irregular tactics, or had no answer for plucky American riflemen. But the reality is that they had institutional knowledge of combat in North America from the French and Indian War that had happened just a decade earlier. They were also led by men who studied and disseminated light infantry and irregular tactics. The British Army also possessed riflemen and light infantry units like the Continental Army, and we will start by discussing those types of troops. Riflemen and light troops could supplement the cavalry in its scouting and skirmishing role. Riflemen and light infantry are firing independently or in pairs, unlike the main lines of infantry. They are in looser formations and also operate with more autonomy and require more initiative from the common soldier than the line infantry would. They are more adept at fighting in broken terrain and are useful for harassing enemy forces that are on the march or still trying to change formations in preparation for combat. For the majority of this battle, the Hessian Jaegers and British light infantry fought against Continental light infantry and Virginia riflemen on the north side of the battlefield. They slowly pushed them back through one ravine after another. Now let's talk about the weapons that the infantry are carrying. We will touch on the differences between smoothbores and rifles in a minute, but in terms of basic loading and firing, virtually all firearms operated in a very similar manner. What I'm carrying here is an example of a French Charleville musket. This is typically what a Continental would be carrying on this battlefield. And the whole process starts right here with what we call the lock. The first thing a soldier would do is he would bring the hammer back one click to the half-cocked position. Essentially, that's his safety, because now you can squeeze the trigger and absolutely nothing happens. What it's also done is that it's moved the hammer out of the way of the pan, because the next thing the soldier would do is he'd reach into a cartridge box, pull out a paper cartridge, tear it open with his teeth, and pour a little bit of the powder into that pan. He then shuts the pan to hold it all in place because he swings the weapon around, and the rest of that powder, the paper, and the ball all go down the muzzle of the weapon. He then draws out the ramrod and uses it just to make sure that everything is seated into the breech of the weapon. Now, once the ramrod is returned, the soldier brings the weapon back up to their chest, and they can either shoulder the weapon and be marched into combat with a loaded musket, or they can go straight into firing. If they want to fire the weapon, the next thing they do, they take their hammer back a second click, and what's going to happen now is when he squeezes the trigger, it's going to fly forward. We're going to have flint hitting steel, popping it open, scraping down the face of it, causing sparks. Sparks will fall into the pan, hitting that initial priming that he started with. Big flash. The flame goes inside of the barrel through what is called the touch hole, hits the main charge, and shoots the musket ball out. Now that process takes several steps, and it takes about 20 to 30 seconds for a professional soldier to load and fire a single shot. This is one of the many factors that shape the way they fight in this era. Another is simply the length of the weapon. To have any hope of loading and firing this musket as fast as possible, the shooter really needs to be standing, not lying down or kneeling trying to take cover. And speed that leads to large volumes of fire is the most important factor for the line infantry. They want to throw clouds of bullets through the air as quickly as possible to slowly shred the enemy line. When they think they have weakened their opponent, they then use another key component to break the enemy line, the bayonet. The socket bayonet allowed a soldier to affix a bayonet to their weapon, and yet it left the muzzle clear so it could still be loaded and fired. Typically an offensive weapon, the ideal hope for a bayonet charge was that you would never make contact with your enemy. Hopefully you've damaged his morale so badly, the mere sight of a line of infantry coming with bayonets at them will cause them to break and run before you ever actually make contact. I am now joined by our friend, the Hessian mannequin, because we're about to talk about the accuracy of these weapons. Muskets of the era show a level of accuracy that is actually understated. One great example is in 1800, a French trial was done by putting a musket into a fixed position and firing it at a target that was 1.7 meters wide by 3 meters tall. By putting it into that fixed position, they were essentially trying to take the human error out of aiming and firing the weapon. And the results they got were, at 80 yards, the musket hit its target 60% of the time. At 160 yards, it hit its target 40% of the time. And at 250 yards, it was still able to hit its target 25% of the time. Other musket tests of the late 18th and early 19th century, using standard infantry standing in line, firing at large targets that represented enemy lines of infantry, were also able to recreate accuracy of 50 to 75% at 100 yards and 30 to 37% at 200 yards. Now initially, it would seem like these high numbers could be backed up by quotes from the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. At the first line, Ensign Dugald Stewart of the 71st Highlanders said, "One half of our Highlanders dropped on that spot," referring to the first shot fired by the militia. In reality, of the 244 men that the 71st Highlanders took into battle that day, 63 were killed or wounded. Now that's still a high rate of casualties, but it's certainly less than what he was expecting that first shot took out. Also at the first line, Sergeant Berthold Koch of the Regiment von Bose said, "At about 100 yards from the enemy line, they delivered a general fire, and 180 men of our von Bose regiment immediately fell." Again, this is also a gross over-exaggeration. Regiment von Bose took over 300 men into battle that day, and they suffered 74 casualties. Again, still a high rate of casualties, but far less than what he was estimating was being taken out by the first shot. So there must be some difference between what a musket can theoretically do and what it's actually doing on the battlefield. Another way we can look at this is by gaming the stats. We're going to look at the 71st Highlanders attacking the North Carolina militia. We're going to isolate them. We're going to move all the statistics so we can try and make their fire seem as accurate as possible. The 71st Highlanders had about 244 men, of which 212 were rank and file soldiers who would be involved in the firing. 212 men fired at the North Carolina militia. The entire North Carolina Militia Brigade reported 11 casualties for the battle and over 500 men missing. Let's double that casualty rate to assume that some of those men listed as missing were actually killed and wounded, making the total 22. And let's say that all were caused by the 71st, And let's say that the 71st suffered 16% misfire rate, so that only 178 muskets fired that shot. 178 muskets causing 22 casualties is a 12% hit rate. Now let's do it in reverse. Let's say the 71st suffered 63 casualties, but let's say that every single one was caused by the North Carolina militia's first volley, despite the fact that the 71st is going to be involved throughout all 2 hours of combat. Now let's say an equal number of militia were firing at the 71st, and let's say they also suffered a 16% misfire rate on their very first shot. That would be 178 men firing one shot that causes 63 casualties. That's a 35% hit rate. Both of those numbers are way below what you would expect for the time, so why is that? Why were so few casualties caused by so many bullets being fired? Let's take a look at some of the possible factors. The first factor we can consider is that loading as quickly as possible and firing on a barked command are not necessarily conducive to the most accurate shot. We now know that the breathing of the firer and their trigger squeeze can also affect the point of aim and the weapon shifting when they actually fire the weapon. So standing out in the open waiting for someone to bark a command at you to fire isn't exactly going to play very well into making sure you have the most accurate shot. Another factor to consider is that a standing position is the least stable position to fire from. The most stable position would be a position where you can lie down, have your weapon supported on something, but these men are standing out in the open and they are supporting the weight of that weapon under their own power. Another factor that needs to be considered is windage. Windage is the distance between the musket ball and the insides of the barrel. Musket balls were actually much smaller than the inside of the barrel, allowing them to be loaded very quickly. The problem is that when it comes back out, it's allowed to bounce around ever so slightly. If the point of aim and direction of travel is allowed to shift even a half degree at the muzzle of the weapon, that potentially means the ball will be moved 18 inches off its point of aim at 60 yards, and 30 inches off its point of aim by the time it's traveled 100 yards. Another factor to consider is something called the Magnuson effect. That refers to the way air passes over a sphere as it travels through the air and can cause it to be pushed one way or the other. Think of the way that a curveball moves when it's thrown. Another factor to consider is the smoke on the battlefield. As they continue firing over and over again, smoke is going to build up and obscure the ability of soldiers to see what exactly they're shooting at. In addition to that, here at Guilford Courthouse, they're fighting in dense woods, so you have all kinds of foliage and trees getting in the way of the shooter and their hopeful target. Another factor to consider is human error. Plain old human error. These are human beings being asked to do amazing things, and they get tired and they get scared, and all those factors can also affect the way they perform in combat. And the final factor to consider is misfires. Misfires are more likely to occur as combat continues. Depending on the sources you look at, some estimate that there was a 1 in 6 misfire rate during combat, that's about 16%, while other sources cite a 1 in 4 misfire rate, that's 25%. The idea of the combat and the tactics of this era was that you got close to your target to negate the effects of all these as your men fired. Firing in volleys delivers clouds of bullets, and that way, hopefully, somebody hits something. Now that brings us to rifles. Rifles have superior accuracy for several reasons. The tight-fitting ball eliminates the bouncing around of a smoothbore because there is no windage between the ball and the sides of the barrel. The tight fit, often aided by a patch on the ball, also provides a better gas seal, which makes the ball fly faster and gives it a flatter trajectory. Rifling also spins the ball as it comes out, giving it a stabilized and predictable flight path. So if rifles are so much more accurate, then why didn't all the armies just issue rifles to their men? Well, mainly for expense reasons. Rifles are expensive to manufacture compared to smoothbores. But another reason is that they prize volume of fire. They are thinking they want men to fire as fast as possible. And another drawback is that it takes a lot longer to load a rifle than a smoothbore. The tight-fitting ball that provides most of the benefits also slows down the process as it has to be forced down the entire length of the barrel, while the ammunition for a smoothbore generally slides in with little effort. The tight fit of the ball could also force much of the fouling that the gunpowder leaves behind back towards the touch hole, making it more likely to become clogged in a shorter amount of time. An additional drawback that militia units have with rifles is that they have the inability to affix a bayonet to the end of their weapon. Their rifles were what they would have used to hunt on a day-to-day basis, and there wasn't any reason for them to buy them and design them with a bayonet in mind. This is a major disadvantage when they face professional soldiers trained in close fighting, equipped with bayonets. After the brigade formed across the open ground, the colonel rode to the front and gave the word, "Charge." Instantly, the movement was made in excellent order in a smart run with arms charged. When arrived within 40 yards of the enemy's line, it was perceived that their whole force had their arms presented and resting on a rail fence. They were taking aim with the nicest precision. Colonel Webster rode forward and said, with more than even his usual commanding voice, "Come on, my brave Fusiliers." They rushed forward amid the enemy's fire. Dreadful was the havoc on both sides. At last the Americans gave way, and the brigade advanced to the attack of their second line. He was placed in the first line, about 200 yards to the right of an open field, and when the British made their charge, he saw the disgraceful retreat of that portion of the militia which was placed behind the fence of the field. He, with most of his company, stood till they gave 4 fires, when finding the retreat pretty general, he also fell back and retreated to the ironworks. We came to a fenced-in wheat field, on the other side of which the enemy, consisting of about 1,500 Continental troops and militia, were deployed en ligne. We tore down most of the fences on our side and jumped over the others without, however, being inconvenienced by the enemy, although they were not more than 300 yards distant. I formed the battalion into line with the utmost dispatch, and we ran to meet the enemy in tolerable order. They fired a volley, but they did not have time to reload, so they took to flight. We sent a volley after them, jumped over the fences, formed the battalion into line, and followed the fugitives at double-pace march.